In this video, I will highlight the soldering stations, which are found at each fabrication station within the freshman engineering classroom. First, let's look at each part of the soldering station. We have the soldering iron, which has a sponge and cleaning element. We have flux. We have solder on a spool. We also have helping hands, which are used to hold the part being soldered. And we have a heat gun. We will highlight each one of these parts within the soldering station as we go through an example of soldering extensions onto a photoresistor. Throughout the video, I will give you safety guidelines and tips, as well as discuss maintenance protocols that you have to abide by in order to maintain the equipment at the soldering station. Prior to soldering your part, you need to make sure that you have a few elements prepared on your soldering station. First, you need to make sure you have your safety glasses on. Anytime you are using soldering stations, you have to have the safety glasses on. Next, you want to make sure that your sponge is wet. You'll use the sponge in order to wipe off excess solder on your tip. Notice this sponge was used without being wet. You can see it has these burn marks on here. That can damage the tip and cause the soldering iron to be unusable. Also, prior to getting started, you want to remove the cap on the cleaning element. This element has a wire brush as well as flux underneath the wire brush. The purpose of the cleaning element on the soldering station is so that solder can be maintained on the tip of the soldering iron so that it allows you to flow the solder onto the part being soldered. You will use the brush in the cleaning element by pushing the tip inside the brush and hitting the flux. Flux is an element that helps solder flow. And so what happens is it allows the solder on the tip to flow evenly onto the tip. Additionally, prior to starting, make sure you're aware of all the warning signs and information on the soldering station. Eye protection required, hot surface. This is all metal and this heats up to a very high temperature, and the metal can also heat up, so be careful. Additionally, use lead-free solder only. That's what we provide you all. Do not breathe the fumes, so make sure you're in a room that has a lot of space, which we have in our classrooms, and avoid contact with flux. So you don't want to just stick your hands inside the flux here. You want to only use it when needed for your part. Now let's solder extensions onto a photoresistor as an example part to solder. After you make sure you have your sponge wet and you have the cleaning element open, you can turn your soldering iron on. The temperature of the soldering iron for this class is typically around 700 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very hot. Again, it can be very dangerous, so you want to make sure that you're maintaining all the safety protocols. Make sure you don't have any loose clothing, make sure your hair is pulled back, and also make sure you're taking everything seriously when you're at the soldering iron. No horseplay or goofing around. Once your soldering iron has heated up to the proper temperature, before you do any soldering on the part, you want to make sure your tip is properly soldered. If there's no solder on the tip, it will not allow you to solder the part. So every time before you get started with soldering, you'll take the tip and put it into the cleaning element. What it does is the wire brush brushes the tip, and the flux that's underneath the brush pushes the solder up. You also should add a little solder to the tip and just repeat the process. Make sure that it flows and that there's solder on the tip. You can see the solder on the tip because it is a little shinier than the other part of the tip. Remember, all the elements that are metal can get very hot, so be conscious of where your hands are when you're holding the soldering iron. Do not set the soldering iron on the table to rest it. Always put it in the stand so that it is up and off of the metal surfaces. Now let's prepare the parts that we are soldering. We will have our photoresistor and we'll have 2 wires that we're gonna add extensions to the photoresistor with. Remember, I talked about the flux, and flux is a useful tool to help the flow of solder. You'll use the flux on the parts being soldered. Take your part and just dip it in the flux. You don't have to get a lot of flux on there. You can barely even see it on there, but it is there, and that will help the solder flow onto the part. Do the same thing for both wires that you're soldering the extensions. So both of these have flux on them now. And then I will use my helping hands to help me hold my part. You don't want to hold the part in your hand because this metal will get hot when you touch the soldering iron to it. So doing one extension at a time, I will use my helping hand to hold my photoresistor and the wire I'm using for the extension. You'll have to maneuver these helping hands in order to get it configured exactly the way you want it. The first thing I would do before I would begin trying to connect the pieces together is I would tin the wire. Just like you added solder onto the tip of the soldering iron, you can add solder onto the parts being soldered prior to putting them together. This process is called tinning. You tin the wire. It's useful because it helps it have solder already on it, so when you put the parts together, all you have to do is add that heat and it'll connect the parts. So add a little solder to your tip of the soldering iron. It should be hot and it should just melt the solder onto it. And then just put it onto the wire that's being soldered. It automatically flows onto it because of the flux that you added on it earlier. If you feel like you have too much solder, you can always wipe off the tip with the sponge, the wet sponge. Once the elements are tinned, you can move the helping hands in order to help you connect them together. There are a few different ways for you to solder this part. One thing you can do is line them up just on top of each other to where you have one part on top of the other, and you might have to hold the helping hand a little bit as you solder. And so these two are lined up on top of each other, and then you can just add the soldering iron, place it on there and melt the solder, and maybe add a little bit more solder as you do it. This can be difficult because it's hard to hold those together. Another method is the loop method. So I can bend my part to start a little loop. You don't want it to be too wide. You can utilize your pliers to help you get the loop smaller, and you can bend the other part to get another loop. I'll take these off the helping hand so you can see them. So you see how you have these 2 loops now, and you can just hook them together and then push them down to where they're hooked on. And this gives you a tight connection that will help you in the soldering process. So I can use my helping hands again. They can hold my parts apart from each other. I have them hooked in. If I want to tighten it a little bit, tighten the hook, you can do that. Now I can touch the heat to the part. The tinned tip will start flowing some solder, but you can also take the solder from your spool and add a little bit more solder in there. Now you don't want to brush. You're not brushing solder on. The way the soldering iron works best is you just use it to add heat, and then you can just push the solder through with the heat. So you just add the heat. The soldering iron heats up the part. And you might need another angle with it. You can see how that soldering iron heats that up. And now I'll kind of wipe it off in the sponge. I'll look at my part, and it's nicely soldered. Now you can see there's a little brown on the connection. That brown is just the burning of the flux that was on my part. I'll repeat the process for the second part. Remember, tin your wires first. That's always useful. Just helps with the flow of the solder when you're connecting the parts. Then, when the element cools down, decide how you want to make that connection. Remember, use the soldering iron to just heat the section up. Don't put your finger too close to the end because you can burn it. You always just want to bring it in from farther away. The solder will automatically melt with the soldering iron and connect the part. You can use the wet sponge again to wipe the tip of the soldering iron. When you release the part from the helping hands, it should be connected, but remember it can still be very hot, so don't touch it. Now you have extensions onto your photoresistor. If I move them around, they're still attached. That solder has connected metal to metal. That's another key thing. Make sure you're not trying to connect the plastic. It has to be metal to metal. The next thing that you're going to do to complete your part is to cover the exposed wire. So you have heat shrink that you can utilize by sliding it over the part that was just soldered, covering the exposed joint. Now, if you have too much solder on your part, it might be difficult for this to go over. You may need to go back to the soldering iron and remove some of that solder that you have exposed. You don't need a lot of solder to connect a part. So if you have big clumps of solder, go back, make sure it's in the helping hands, don't hold it with your own hands, and remove the solder with the soldering iron. Once your heat shrink is over the joint, you can turn the heat gun on. You do not need to take the heat gun off of this station. The heat will shoot out from here. It's basically like a big hair dryer. And you have two different positions. If you do the middle position, it's cold. So if it's blowing cold air, you need to push it one more time to get the hot air. You can just hold the part over the heat gun. You don't have to be right on it. The heat actually shoots out. So hold the part over. Make sure your hand isn't over the heat gun because that'll heat your hand up. If it makes you more comfortable, you can hold the part with pliers and just hold it over the heat gun and let the heat shrink. Now you have a part that is fully soldered. The extensions are on the photoresistor and they are covered using heat shrink so that they're not exposed. Once you are finished soldering your part, set it aside and complete the final parts of the maintenance procedure. The final parts of the maintenance procedure are to ensure that the tip of the soldering iron still has solder. Even if you see solder on the tip of the soldering iron, we still want you to put it in the cleaning element, add some solder to the tip, put it through the cleaning element one more time so that that solder flows onto the tip. Look at it, make sure it's shiny, return it to the stand, turn off the soldering iron. After it cools down, replace the cap onto the cleaning element. You do not want to leave the cap off because it will dry up the flux underneath the wire brush. Also, ensure that the cap is securely fastened on the flux within the stand. Make sure your solder is turned on the spool and does not have excess hanging over. Ensure that the soldering iron is off, the heat gun is off, and you have everything cleaned up around the station. We ask that you follow these safety guidelines as well as maintenance protocols anytime you use the soldering stations. As long as you follow these guidelines and protocols, these soldering stations will be maintained and will be able to be used for many classes.